Welcome to Lecture 9, Persuading the Politicians How to Deploy Evidence to Influence Policy. Lecture 8 demonstrated that the British public is substantially more favourable to redistributive government action than politicians assume, and that conjoint analysis can measure those preferences precisely. But knowing what people currently prefer and measuring it accurately is only the first stage. Public opinion is not fixed. The assumption that it is, that communities in left-behind constituencies hold immovable value-based positions against progressive reform, is both empirically wrong and politically self-defeating. This lecture addresses the second stage. How do you actively shift public opinion in favour of transformative evidence-based policy? The answer is adversarial co-production of narratives, a method that adapts adversarial collaboration from behavioural science to develop persuasive arguments by working with opponents of a policy rather than its supporters. This is the culmination of the course's argument. Evidence produced in the previous 4 lectures on costs, distributional effects, health impacts, and current public preferences is necessary but not sufficient to move policy. It must be connected to narrative. This lecture tells you how. We cover 11 topics, building from the theoretical case for adversarial co-production through the 3-stage method to the empirical findings and their political implications. The first 3 topics establish why the standard approaches, policy as evidence presentation and nudging, fail and why narrative persuasion is the alternative. Topics 4 through 7 describe the method in detail. Topics 8 through 11 present the findings and connect them to the political strategy that flows from them. The lecture contains a concrete activity for your own practice. Co-production of a narrative from data provided by opponents of progressive tax reform. We open this lecture with a critical but underappreciated insight. Measuring what people currently prefer is not the same as understanding what they would prefer if differently informed, or how their preferences would respond to well-constructed argument. The conjoint analysis in the previous lecture established current preferences under conditions of forced trade-offs. That is essential information. But it is not fixed truth about an immovable reality. It is important to emphasize one of the most significant asymmetries in contemporary politics: the right's willingness to invest in long-term persuasion campaigns compared to the centre's deference to existing opinion. Brexit did not succeed because a majority of British people had always wanted to leave the EU. It succeeded because a sustained campaign of argument, much of it factually inaccurate, some of it genuinely responsive to real material grievances, shifted opinion enough to produce a majority. Progressive politicians can learn from this. The critique of conventional co-production is sharp and worth noting carefully. Co-production in the standard sense, involving service users in the design and delivery of public services, is genuinely valuable, but it does not address the political feasibility problem. If service users tell you they want better care homes, but the government believes politically feasible funding is insufficient to deliver them, conventional co-production produces frustration rather than change. The focus group trap is the most practically damaging version of treating preferences as fixed. When politicians commission qualitative research that concludes working-class communities oppose immigration on racial grounds, and then design policy around that conclusion, more flag-waving, tougher rhetoric, they are both misreading the evidence and abandoning the people who most need change. This is empirically wrong. Those communities' expressed positions are responses to material conditions that redistribution could address, not fixed identity commitments. The nudging critique in this lecture is important because nudging has been so influential in public health and policy analysis circles for 2 decades. The Behavioural Insights team, the Nudge Unit, was created by the Cameron government, has been replicated in dozens of countries, and has attracted enormous academic investment. Meyer et al.'s 2022 meta-analysis suggests that this investment has been largely wasted. Meyer et al.'s finding about publication bias is methodologically important. When they apply statistical corrections for the well-documented tendency of academic journals to publish positive results and not null results, the apparent evidence base for nudging largely evaporates. What looks like a robust empirical case for nudging interventions across health, finance, and environmental behavior is in significant part an artifact of selective publication. The nudging paradigm's deeper problem, which Dowding identifies, is ideological. It is designed to change behavior without acknowledging structural causes and without requiring structural change. A nudge that makes fruit more visible in a canteen is a response to obesity that does not require addressing food poverty, poor housing, or insecure employment. It allows policymakers to claim they are addressing public health while leaving the social determinants untouched. This is not neutral pragmatism. It is a political choice with measurable costs. The historical point about the Overton window is the corrective. The assumption that radical change is impossible has been falsified repeatedly by history. The creation of the NHS in 1948 was described by its opponents as economically unaffordable and ideologically dangerous. The neoliberal reforms of 1979 onwards were described by their opponents as politically impossible and socially damaging. Both sets of opponents were wrong about feasibility, though the NHS's opponents were wrong about consequences in the opposite direction to the neoliberal reforms' opponents. The argument that transformative progressive change is permanently infeasible is not a historical fact. It is a political claim that can be contested. The embedded YouTube video outlines behavioral insights and nudge theory in greater detail. The theoretical foundation for adversarial co-production rests on a specific psychological claim about how reasoning and persuasion work. Let me explain the claim carefully, because it is counterintuitive and well supported. Fisher's contrast between rational choice and narrative paradigms is the starting point. In the rational choice paradigm, people evaluate arguments by assessing the quality of the evidence presented and update their beliefs accordingly. This is the model that underlies most policy communication. Present the evidence, and rational actors will update their positions. In the narrative paradigm, people are storytellers who evaluate arguments not by their evidential quality, but by whether they fit within their existing framework of culturally and historically situated stories about how the world works. Mercier and Sperber's interpersonal theory of reasoning is the deeper theoretical support. On their account, reasoning did not evolve to allow individual minds to reach true conclusions. It evolved as a social capacity for persuasion and coordination between individuals with potentially divergent interests. The implication is that reasoning works best dialogically. When challenged by someone with a different position, people produce better arguments and sometimes genuinely update their beliefs in ways that individual reflection does not achieve. The practical implication for adversarial co-production follows directly. If reasoning is fundamentally interpersonal, then the people best positioned to identify what would persuade opponents of a policy are the opponents themselves. A supporter of basic income who writes a 150-word argument for basic income is writing for people who already broadly agree. An opponent of basic income who is asked to write a 150-word argument for it is producing something genuinely different, an argument that addresses the specific concerns they themselves hold, using the kind of language and example that resonates with people who share those concerns. The embedded YouTube video outlines narrative impact in further detail. The choice of red wall constituencies as the primary target population for the Act Now surveys reflects a specific strategic judgment. These are the communities where the political case for progressive redistribution is most contested, where progressive parties have most recently lost support, and where the electoral consequences of getting the advocacy strategy wrong are most acute. The screening survey serves two functions simultaneously. It produces basic prevalence data on support for each policy area across the target population. It's self-useful for characterizing where each policy stands before any deliberative intervention. And it identifies the specific individuals who hold firm opposition, scores of 20 or below on the 100-point scale, who will be invited to participate in Stage 2. The example of education reform from Hudson et al., 2025, is instructive because it illustrates the specificity of the policy descriptions. This is not a vague question about whether people value education. It is a specific package of reforms. A spending increase to pre-austerity levels, removal of private school charitable status, prohibition of profit-making schools, and removal of tuition fees. The brief bullet point format is designed to give respondents enough information to have a genuine reaction to the actual content of the policy, not just to an abstraction. The Prolific platform is worth understanding practically. Prolific is an online participant recruitment service that allows researchers to specify detailed eligibility criteria, including postcode areas. For Redwall targeting, researchers can specify postcodes corresponding to constituencies in the North and Midlands of England and Wales that voted Conservative in 2019, having historically voted Labour. This geographic targeting is what makes the sample relevant to the political questions being asked. Stage 2 is the methodological innovation that distinguishes adversarial co-production from all previous approaches to policy narrative development. The standard approach to developing persuasive policy narratives is to convene supporters of the policy, researchers, advocates, communications professionals, and ask them to write arguments for it. This produces arguments that resonate with people who already broadly agree with the underlying values. It does not produce arguments that address the specific objections of people who disagree. Asking firm opponents to write persuasive arguments for the policy inverts this. The opponents are not being asked to change their minds. They are being asked to do a cognitive exercise. Imagine you were trying to persuade someone like yourself to support this policy. What would you say? The Mercier and Sperber theory predicts that this exercise, because it requires taking the interpersonal persuasion perspective rather than the intrapersonal confirmation perspective, will produce qualitatively different and more effective arguments. The four themes that emerge from the education narratives are worth examining in some detail because they illustrate the range of argumentative logics that opponents themselves generate. The absolute gains narrative frames the policy as universally beneficial. Every child, every community. The relative gains narrative frames it as a redistribution of advantage away from the wealthy toward ordinary people. The security narrative frames it as stability and protection against a chaotic and failing system. The economic benefit narrative frames it as an investment in productivity and growth. Note that these are not the frames that a policy communications expert would necessarily generate. They are the frames that opponents of the policy, people who began with a score of 20 or below on the support scale, generated when asked to make the case for it. This is the key empirical claim of adversarial co-production, that opponents know what would persuade them, and their articulation of that is more valuable than any externally designed communication strategy. The Stage 3 is a standard pre-post treatment survey with random assignment to narrative condition, conducted at a scale large enough to permit subgroup analysis by income, health status, political affiliation, and other characteristics that the theory predicts should moderate responsiveness to narrative treatment. The pre-treatment measurement of support is essential for two reasons. First, it establishes baseline opinion for the specific policy in question, which may differ from the screening survey if time has passed or context has changed. Second, it enables identification of subgroups by initial support level. Lovers, greater than or equal to 70, haters, less than or equal to 30, and those in between, whose responsiveness to the narrative treatment may differ systematically. The randomized assignment to narrative condition is what allows causal inference about narrative effects. Because participants are randomly assigned to receive one of the four narrative types, any difference in post-treatment support between groups can be attributed to the narrative rather than to pre-existing differences between participants. The demographic battery is unusually comprehensive compared to standard political opinion surveys, and each element reflects theoretical predictions about what should moderate narrative responsiveness. The MacArthur ladder of subjective socioeconomic status asks respondents to place themselves on a 10-rung ladder representing society from the bottom to the top. This subjective measure is included because it captures perceived relative position better than objective income for some purposes. Someone with a high income but large mortgage payments may feel economically precarious in a way that the income question does not capture. The faith in politicians scale is particularly important for interpreting the political challenge. Those who most need redistributive policy may support it in principle, but not translate that support into voting behaviour because they do not believe government can deliver it. The headline finding requires careful interpretation. An average increase of 0.72 points across all participants sounds modest and was not statistically significant. But this average conceals a much more important pattern. The ceiling effect is the first thing to understand. 18.11% of participants chose 100 out of 100 at the pre-treatment stage. They were already at maximum support. No narrative can increase support among people who are already at the top of the scale. Including these participants in the average mathematically suppresses the effect size. This is not a methodological problem. It is the correct analytical choice for measuring population-level effects. But it means the overall average understates the effect among those where it matters. The finding among firm opponents, an increase of 4.04 points, with p equals 0.0092, is the key result. These are people who began with support scores of 30 or below. A 4-point increase represents a meaningful shift in the context of a scale where they started between 0 and 30, and statistical significance at p less than 0.01 means we can be confident this is not a chance finding. Adversarial co-production works, and it works specifically for the people it is designed to work for. The predictor analysis is theoretically important. The finding that lower SES and poorer health predict both higher baseline support and greater responsiveness to narratives is exactly what material interest theory predicts. People who stand to benefit most from redistribution are aware of their interests and can be persuaded by arguments that connect to those interests. The assumption that these communities hold fixed, value-based opposition to progressive reform is not supported by the evidence. What is supported is the finding that they lack faith in government's ability to deliver, which is a very different problem requiring a very different political response. The pattern of basic income support across the three schemes from our Act Now research adds an important dimension to the picture from Lecture 7's conjoint analysis, where the conjoint experiment measured preferences on hypothetical policy features. The Act Now surveys measured support for specific, named schemes with defined payment levels. The finding that Scheme 2, the intermediate scheme, paying £185 per week to working-age adults, is the most popular is important. If voters were driven purely by fiscal conservatism, Scheme 1, the cheapest option, would be most popular. If they were driven purely by generosity, Scheme 3 would be most popular. The intermediate scheme being most popular suggests something more specific. Respondents are making a holistic assessment that weighs generosity, affordability, and personal benefit. The in-group/out-group distinction is theoretically significant and practically important for policy design. Scheme 1, the starter scheme, is modest enough that it resembles existing means-tested payments. It may be perceived as a payment for people who are already receiving benefits, which places recipients in the category of others with whom voters do not necessarily identify. Schemes 2 and 3, by contrast, are generous enough that people in work, people who vote, can clearly see themselves as beneficiaries. This changes the political calculus entirely. The political implication is counterintuitive but strongly evidenced. Progressive politicians who design means-tested starter schemes as more politically acceptable because they are cheaper may actually be making them less politically acceptable, because the means testing marks recipients as the poor rather than as members of the general population. Universal payments that are large enough to benefit the middle of the income distribution may be more politically sustainable than targeted payments to the poorest, even though the latter are cheaper. This is the policy design lesson from the in-group/out-group analysis. The political challenge section of the lecture identifies a specific and tractable problem. The people most in need of redistribution often support it in principle, but do not translate that support into consistent political engagement. The control paradox captures this precisely. Low perceived control predicts both higher support for redistribution and lower faith in government. The same material circumstances that make redistribution most needed also erode the political confidence required to demand it. The chaos tactic is worth understanding as a deliberate political strategy rather than a natural property of public opinion. Claims that progressive policies would produce chaos and unpredictability, a coalition of chaos, maximum mania, maximum chaos, are designed to activate exactly the anxiety avoidance preferences that the evidence on depressive traits shows are concentrated among those most harmed by inequality. The tactic works not because people are irrational, but because it exploits a genuine psychological pattern in the people it targets. The counter-strategy is to reframe the direction of chaos. Rather than accepting the framing in which change equals chaos and continuity equals stability, progressive politicians should establish that the current system is the source of insecurity, unpredictability, and chaos in people's lives, and that redistribution is the means of achieving the control and stability voters are seeking. This is not a dishonest framing, it is an accurate one. A welfare system that can sanction claimants at short notice, that requires repeated assessment of disability in ways experienced as humiliating and uncertain, and that leaves millions in precarious employment with unpredictable income, is objectively chaotic for those who depend on it. On funding, we need to return to the conjoint findings from the previous lecture. The public prefer wealth taxes and carbon taxes to government borrowing as funding mechanisms for generous welfare. This means that the political ground is available for a narrative that externalizes the cost of redistribution onto assets and pollution rather than onto wage income. Combined with the historical observation that the last decade of significant deficit expansion, including the COVID-19 fiscal response, was associated with few visible day-to-day consequences, there is genuine scope for investment-based rather than austerity-based framing of fiscal reform. The raw arguments you can access from https://osf.io/htdy6/files/tjrus were produced by people who actively oppose progressive tax reform. Your task is not to dismiss their concerns, it is to find within those concerns the hooks that make a persuasive case for the policy. This is counterintuitive, and it is the methodological heart of adversarial co-production. Opponents are not wrong about everything. They may have genuine concerns about trust in government, about whether tax revenue will be spent effectively, about the fairness of asking some to pay more. The narratives that work are the ones that acknowledge those concerns and then redirect them toward the policy, not the ones that ignore or ridicule them. Look for the most frequent themes in the raw arguments. In typical exercises on progressive taxation, common concerns include government waste and whether the money will actually reach those who need it, fairness and whether the burden is shared appropriately, economic impact and whether higher taxes will deter investment or enterprise, and trust in the political system. These are real concerns held by real people, and they are the raw material for your narratives. The 140 to 160 word constraint is strict and important. Persuasive political communication is brief. A narrative that requires 500 words to make its case will not be read. Everything in your 150 words must earn its place: the protagonist, the antagonist, the material context, and the connection to the policy. When you have drafted both narratives, read them aloud and ask whether they feel authentic, as if they could have been written by someone who genuinely opposes the reform but can now see its merit. If the narrative sounds like a policy brief, rewrite it. If it sounds like someone who understands the reader's position, you are on the right track. The conclusion of this lecture is the conclusion of the course's argument. Let me state it precisely. Adversarial co-production is not a communications trick. It is a methodological approach grounded in the psychology of reasoning and the sociology of persuasion, which produces empirically testable predictions and falsifiable results. It works, particularly for firm opponents, who are precisely the people that progressive advocacy most needs to reach. And it has now been applied successfully to multiple policy domains beyond welfare and basic income, confirming that the method generalizes. There are groups whose opposition to evidence-based policy is not rooted in misunderstanding or lack of information, but in ideological commitments that would produce genuinely harmful outcomes if incorporated into policy. Climate change denial, eugenics, and various forms of sectarian discrimination are examples. The safeguards are qualitative review of narratives produced, and the observation that the method is not asking opponents to design policy. It is asking them to identify what would persuade people like them of the merits of a specific, predefined policy. The risk of extremist distortion is manageable. The risk of continued alienation of left-behind communities, if the method is not used, is not. The epistemic justice framing deserves emphasis. Adversarial co-production is not just instrumentally effective, it is also a way of taking seriously the knowledge and experience of people who are typically excluded from evidence-based policy processes. The communities most affected by inequality, insecurity, and inadequate public services are exactly the communities whose voices conventional, technocratic policymaking marginalizes. Giving those voices a genuine role in developing the arguments for policy change is both more likely to succeed and more consistent with the values of democratic politics. The 1945 precedent is the right historical note. The creation of the National Health Service was opposed as unaffordable, ideologically dangerous, and politically impractical. It was none of those things. It was essential. The cost of not creating it, in preventable deaths, in economic productivity, loss to ill health, in the social fabric that universal access to healthcare helps maintain, would have dwarfed the cost of creating it. The same argument applies to basic income, to the Green New Deal, to adequate social care for an aging population. The question is not whether we can afford to do these things. The question is whether we can afford not to,